My name is Nina Caldwell. I was 32 years old when my own family taught me that being useful and being loved were not the same thing. It was a Friday afternoon in my parents' kitchen. My brother, Jake, stood there with his car keys already spinning around his index finger. He was wearing an expensive linen shirt meant for the coastal breeze, his leather weekend bag resting by the door. Outside in the driveway, his wife, Melissa, was waiting in the passenger seat, tapping her phone screen as if this Malibu trip was a royal appointment I was actively ruining. From the living room, the sound of a cartoon theme song played on a loop. Jake's 4-year-old twins, Ava and Leo, were sitting on the rug, sticky-fingered and sleepy. They had no idea the adults in the next room were about to use them as a weapon. Jake didn't ask me to watch his children for the weekend. He ordered me. He checked his watch and told me I needed to keep the kids out of the sun between noon and 3. I looked at him and said one word, no. I didn't shout it. I didn't say it cruelly. I just said no. I explained that I had a client emergency, a company payroll to approve, and a business meeting I had already rescheduled twice because this family always expected my time to bend around their convenience. The kitchen went completely silent. My parents, who had been hovering near the counter, suddenly looked at me as if I had committed treason. Jake's face twisted, not with shock, but with pure entitlement. Then he stepped forward, raised his hand, and brought his palm crashing across my cheek. The slap was so hard my ear rang. "That's what family is for," he spat. "Stop being so selfish." But the physical strike wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that followed. My mother didn't rush to check my face. She just stared down at the granite countertop. My father let out a heavy, irritated sigh, as if I was the one making a scene. Jake didn't even drop his car keys. He still truly believed he was going to Malibu. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. Instead, I quietly picked up my car keys, slung my laptop bag over my shoulder, and patted the side pocket to make sure the thick folder was still inside. They didn't notice the folder, and they certainly did not know that the documents inside it were about to completely dismantle their entire luxurious lifestyle, piece by piece, before they even reached the highway. Before I tell you exactly what was inside that folder and how fast their perfect weekend crumbled, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Drop your city and the current weather in the comments below. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of highway lines and suffocating silence. It wasn't until I finally locked my own front door that the adrenaline evaporated, leaving my knees weak. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. A furious, red handprint was blooming across my jawline. I could almost hear my mother's polished, disappointed voice echoing in my head. "Nina, sweetheart, don't make a big deal out of nothing. Men get frustrated." But then another voice surfaced, the raspy, unapologetic tone of my late grandmother Ruth. "Nina," she had warned me years ago, "they will call you selfish the exact moment you stop being useful." I didn't reach for an ice pack. I reached for my phone and dialed Olivia Grant, my attorney and oldest friend. When she answered, my voice was devoid of any warmth. "He hit me. I'm done." Olivia didn't gasp. She didn't offer empty sympathies. She operated in facts. "Are Ava and Leo safe?" "Yes," I replied. "They're at the house with both grandparents." "Good," Olivia stated, the sharp click of a keyboard already sounding in the background. "Then protect yourself, Nina. Lock it all down before they try to rewrite the narrative." I opened my laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated my dining table as I began dismantling the financial lifeblood of my family. I logged into my company portal, Caldwell Coastal Services, and went to work. Click. The Cliffside Malibu reservation canceled. Jake hadn't paid the required balance anyway. Click. The family emergency credit card frozen immediately. Click. Jake's authorization for the company SUV revoked. Click. The exclusive beach club guest privileges they love to flaunt. Terminated. Click. His phantom consulting stipend deleted from payroll. Click. The smart lock passcodes to my equipment warehouse erased. Finally, I drafted a sterile 3-sentence email to my parents, Jake and Melissa. No insults, no threats, just a formal notification that all personal access to my business assets, vehicles, and discretionary funds was suspended pending a legal review. I hit send. 12 minutes later, my phone lit up. It was Jake, then Melissa, then my mother. Over the next 2 hours, the screen flashed relentlessly with 63 missed calls and 108 frantic text messages. But it was the single, panicking voicemail from Melissa that proved they hadn't given my bruised cheek a second thought. While I sat in my darkened kitchen, pressing a bag of frozen peas against my swelling jaw, a very different scene was unfolding 70 miles away along the Pacific Coast Highway. Jake and Melissa had arrived at their stunning cliffside rental in Malibu. They strolled into the expansive glass-walled lobby, looking every inch the affluent, carefree couple they pretended to be. Several of their friends, couples they were trying desperately to impress, were trailing right behind them, lugging designer weekender bags. Melissa was probably already visualizing the aesthetic photos she would post on her lifestyle blog. Then they approached the concierge desk. The receptionist tapped a few keys, frowned, and delivered the first blow. "I apologize, sir, but this reservation was canceled an hour ago by the primary account holder." Jake forced a tight, embarrassed laugh, glancing nervously over his shoulder at his friends. He pulled out his own credit card, the one he always conveniently forgot to use when the bill arrived, and slid it across the marble counter. "Must be a glitch. Just put the hold on this." The receptionist swiped it, declined. The hold limit for a luxury villa was far beyond Jake's actual financial reality. Melissa, panicking, shoved her card forward, declined. Before Jake could even begin to spin a lie, his phone buzzed. It was the private boat charter company, informing him that the security deposit had been reversed. Seconds later, an email popped up from their hired private chef, demanding immediate wire transfer confirmation before he would even begin shopping for groceries. The illusion was shattering in real time. One of Jake's friends, a guy he constantly bragged to about his lucrative consulting gigs, leaned in and asked the fatal question, "Hey man, why does a grown man's vacation depend on his sister's card?" Jake's face flushed, a deep, humiliating crimson. Melissa grabbed his arm, dragged him into a quiet alcove near the restrooms, and frantically dialed my number. When I didn't pick up, she left the voicemail that effectively killed any lingering guilt I might have had. I played it on speakerphone, the audio echoing in my quiet apartment. "Nina, please," she whispered, her voice trembling, not with remorse, but with sheer terror of public humiliation. "They won't let us check in. The card declined. The boat company says the deposit was reversed. People are here. Everyone is asking questions. Just turn it back on." She paused, taking a shaky breath before adding the sentence that changed me forever. "Okay, we can talk about the slap later." We can talk about the slap later. That was the precise moment my empathy flatlined. To my family, my physical pain and shattered boundaries were an administrative hurdle to be dealt with later. Preserving their fake, glamorous facade in front of strangers was the actual emergency. I saved the audio file, forwarded it directly to Olivia, and turned off my notifications. I thought I had just ruined a weekend getaway. But what I didn't know yet was that pulling this financial thread was about to unravel a massive, documented conspiracy they had been hiding in my father's desk for months. To understand why their glamorous reality disintegrated the absolute second I walked away, you have to understand my actual position in that house. I wasn't just a sister or a dutiful daughter. I was the invisible machinery keeping their entire existence operational. For years, I functioned as their unpaid crisis manager and financial safety net. If my parents' medical bills went to collections, I quietly settled the balance. When Jake's auto lease inexplicably fell through, I handed him the keys to a Caldwell Coastal Services SUV. If Melissa forgot the preschool tuition, my accounts bridged the gap. If a vetted nanny quit, I was the one interviewing replacements while simultaneously managing my own corporate staff. They never explicitly treated me like a subordinate. Instead, they weaponized my competence. My parents loved to smile warmly and say, "You're just so much better at handling these logistics, Nina." For a long time, I mistook that dependence for affection. I didn't realize their praise was actually a meticulously crafted cage designed to keep the golden goose producing. But as I sat in my quiet apartment that night, recent conversations began to echo in my mind with a sickening new clarity. Remarks that had previously sounded like casual concern were suddenly glaring red flags. Like my father asking over Sunday roast, "Nina, if you ever get too overwhelmed, who actually steps in to hold the reins? Grandma Ruth's business is a family legacy after all." Or Jake chuckling a few weeks prior, "One of these days, that company is going to need a proper Caldwell man at the helm." Even Melissa had slipped up, murmuring over coffee, "Honestly, once everything gets restructured, I think we'll all breathe a lot easier." At the time, I foolishly assumed they were hinting at helping me carry the operational burden. I believed my family was merely taking advantage of my generosity, skimming off the top of my hard work to fund their comforts. I was devastatingly wrong. They weren't just happily draining my wallet. As I was about to discover, they were actively finalizing a legal blueprint to steal my entire empire. To fully grasp the magnitude of their entitlement, you have to look back at the only person in our bloodline who ever saw me clearly, my grandmother, Ruth. She didn't view me as a convenient household appliance or an endless well of free labor. She saw a young woman with fierce discipline and a quiet, bleeding heart. Before she passed away, Ruth bypassed my parents and Jake entirely, leaving me a tiny, struggling property management firm. It wasn't a gold mine, it was a test of endurance. As she signed over the paperwork, her hands fragile, but her gaze piercing, she gave me a warning I would never forget. "Nina, money and love should never be tangled tightly enough to strangle each other. Remember, the exact day you stop being useful, they will call you selfish." By the time I turned 26, I had transformed her small, chaotic gift into Caldwell Coastal Services, a highly profitable enterprise with dedicated employees, corporate clients, and strict operational protocols. The company was my legal asset, built by my own sweat and sleepless nights. But because I desperately wanted to be a supportive sister and a dutiful daughter, I allowed my family to reap the benefits of the infrastructure I had built. I thought my financial support was a firewall, protecting them from hardship. I didn't realize that by constantly funding their comforts, I was breeding a toxic delusion. My ongoing generosity blurred a very dangerous line in their minds. They stopped seeing my assistance as a favor to be grateful for, and gradually began viewing my entire corporate empire as their inherent property. And absolutely no one embraced that twisted delusion more fiercely or more publicly than my brother Jake. Jake didn't just enjoy my money. He forged an entire identity out of it. To the outside world, he was a thriving entrepreneur and the ultimate provider. He drove a top-tier SUV, casually boasting to his golf buddies about its horsepower, conveniently omitting that the vehicle's title belonged to Caldwell Coastal Services. Every month, he received a handsome consulting stipend through my payroll system, a phantom role that required absolutely zero actual output, but allowed him to brag about his executive influence at dinner parties. Melissa eagerly participated in this grand masquerade. Her social media feeds were meticulously curated with snapshots of an idyllic, affluent lifestyle, sipping champagne at the private beach club, spontaneous coastal retreats, and pristine childcare. She portrayed the perfect, self-made suburban matriarch. Yet, she never disclosed to her followers that the preschool tuition, the emergency sitters, and the luxury yacht deposits were entirely subsidized by her sister-in-law's exhausting daily grind. Jake didn't demand the Malibu trip because he desperately needed to hear the ocean waves. He needed it as a stage. It was a prop to validate the fiction he had sold to his peers. When the concierge rejected his card, the true catastrophe wasn't the loss of a vacation. It was the sudden, terrifying exposure of his own mediocrity. But while Jake was frantically pacing that lobby, desperately trying to salvage his hollow reputation, my attorney and I were already moving past anger. We were quietly gathering the exact ammunition needed to ensure that Mask never went back on. 40 minutes after I sent the lockdown email, Olivia arrived at my apartment carrying takeout containers, a digital voice recorder, and an expression that explicitly forbade me from minimizing what had just happened. She didn't offer me a fragile hug. She offered strategy. First, she positioned me under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the kitchen pendant lights and took time-stamped photographs of the swelling, purple mark across my cheek. "You don't have to press criminal charges tonight," she stated, methodically reviewing the high-definition images on her phone. "But in families like yours, the truth requires paperwork, screenshots, and sometimes bruises cataloged under fluorescent lighting." While she was organizing a master digital folder for my corporate assets, meticulously separating the vehicle logs, the Malibu reservation details, and the frozen credit card statements, my phone vibrated. A text from Jake lit up the screen. "You better answer before I come over." Olivia didn't flinch. She took my phone and typed a sterile response with my permission. "Do not come to my home. All communication must be in writing." His reply was instantaneous and venomous. "You think you're powerful because Grandma gave you a little business? You're nothing without this family." A single tear finally escaped, not because his cruel words were true, but because for a decade I had lived my life in constant, exhausting terror that they might be. My only lingering hesitation was the twins. I refused to let Ava and Leo become collateral damage in an adult war. I called Marisol, a licensed sitter I had previously vetted for them, and paid for 4 hours of her time out of my personal checking account. I texted my mother the confirmation. Ava and Leo shouldn't be punished. Marisol is covered for tonight only. After that, their parents need to arrange their own childcare. My mother's reply was painfully predictable. "So you admit you can help? You just want control." I stared at the glowing screen, a profound realization settling deep in my chest. To them, control was simply the word they used for any boundary they could no longer freely cross. The following morning, my mother demanded a formal family meeting at their house to discuss this like adults. She fully expected the old Nina to show up, apologetic, pliable, and ready to open her wallet. But the woman walking into their living room wasn't coming alone, and she certainly wasn't coming unarmed. When Olivia and I stepped into my parents' living room, the atmosphere was suffocating. Jake was pacing aggressively near the stone fireplace, still wearing the wrinkled linen shirt meant for his ruined coastal getaway. Melissa sat rigidly on the sofa, her oversized sunglasses pushed up into her hair, her mouth pressed into a thin, humiliated line. My parents stood shoulder to shoulder behind the coffee table, waiting for me like a tribunal, preparing to sentence a rogue defendant. My mother spoke first, her tone dripping with disdain. "You brought a lawyer to a private family conversation?" Olivia offered a terrifyingly polite smile. "After a physical assault and multiple financial threats? Yes, I am here." Jake scoffed, throwing his hands up. "Assault? I slapped my sister because she was acting completely insane." He delivered the excuse as if he were explaining a minor parking infraction. Olivia silently reached into her briefcase and placed the high-definition photograph of my bruised cheek onto the glass coffee table. It sat there, glaring and undeniable. Nobody reached for it. Nobody asked if it still hurt. Nobody apologized. I sat across from them, opening the thick manila folder on my lap. "I am not here to debate the slap," I said, my voice shockingly steady. "You either believe striking me was wrong, or you don't. Your collective behavior since yesterday gives me my answer. I am solely here to explain what changes starting today." Jake let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You don't get to walk in here and make announcements like you're the CEO of this family." I held his gaze, unblinking. "No, but I am the CEO of the company you have been bleeding dry." The silence that followed was absolute. I began laying out the paper trail. First, the Malibu reservation was strictly under my corporate account. Because you failed to pay the outstanding balance, it was canceled. It was never your property. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. The emergency card was frozen over one little misunderstanding. I only used it once for a dinner. Olivia smoothly slid a highlighted bank statement across the glass. 7 times, actually, including restaurant tabs, luxury spa deposits, and a designer jacket coded fraudulently as client hospitality. Melissa flushed a deep, blotchy red. I turned my attention back to Jake. "You have been driving a Caldwell Coastal Services SUV for 18 months. In that time, you have accumulated unpaid toll violations, parking tickets, and bumper damage. Your authorization is permanently revoked. You have 48 hours to return the keys and the vehicle, or it will be reported to the police as unauthorized possession." Jake leaned forward, his jaw clenched. "You wouldn't dare. Yesterday, you taught me what you dare to do," I replied coldly. "Today, you learn what I do." Finally, I passed them the summary sheet. It wasn't a list of hurt feelings. It was a devastating ledger of systemic extraction. The total sat at the bottom like a legal verdict, $184,730 over 6 years. That excluded interest, unpaid labor, and business risk. My father collapsed into a velvet armchair. All the wind knocked out of his righteous indignation. Melissa stared at the number, whispering, "Jake, did you know it was that much?" Jake snapped at his wife, "Don't start." And right there, in 2 words, the cracks in their perfect marriage became starkly visible. The meeting might have ended with that crushing financial reality if Melissa had just kept her mouth shut. But embarrassment has a funny way of loosening the wrong tongues. As Jake frantically argued with Olivia about whether a family understanding superseded corporate contracts, Melissa muttered under her breath, glaring at the floor. This wouldn't even matter if the transfer had just gone through. The entire room froze. Olivia slowly turned her head. My mother gasped, a terrified whisper escaping her lips. "Melissa!" A cold dread began to spread outward from my chest, freezing my blood. I looked directly at my sister-in-law. "What transfer?" The silence in the living room was no longer just tense, it was radioactive. Melissa looked utterly terrified, clamping her mouth shut as she realized she had just blown the lid off a hidden vault. Jake's face drained of color, the arrogant sneer instantly replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed panic. My father shot up from his velvet armchair so fast it skidded backward. "That is completely irrelevant," he stammered, his voice cracking. Olivia didn't even blink. She locked her gaze on him. "If it's irrelevant, Frank, then you won't mind explaining it to your daughter." The truth didn't just emerge, it was dragged out into the harsh afternoon light, kicking and screaming. For months, entirely behind my back, my family had been consulting with a wealth manager, using my company's financial data. They had devised a scheme they affectionately dubbed the Legacy Plan. They wrapped their greed in the polite, sterile language of estate consolidation, convincing themselves that because Grandma Ruth was family, the business she left me inherently belonged to the collective bloodline. Olivia forced my father to open the hallway desk and hand over the physical draft. As my eyes scanned the heavy parchment, the sheer scale of their betrayal made my stomach turn. They didn't just want a piece of the pie, they had mapped out a corporate coup. Under this proposed family trust, Jake, a man who couldn't even successfully manage a boat rental deposit, was slated to become the director of strategic development. My father would receive a lucrative, paid advisory role. My mother was penciled in for a monthly family care distribution. Even Melissa's Vanity Lifestyle blog was listed as a salaried marketing partner. They had the ambush meticulously planned. They were going to wait until my mother's upcoming birthday dinner, surround me with relatives, pour me wine, praise my generosity, and push these papers across the table. If I resisted, Jake would accuse me of abandoning the family. If I hesitated, my mother would cry. But the true poison was buried on the third page, in the governance clauses. Olivia read the kill shot aloud. Major, operational decisions require approval from 2 of the 3 voting members. The 3 proposed members? Me, Jake, and my father. They weren't stepping in to alleviate my stress. They were legally structuring a mechanism to outvote me and hijack the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. The slap in the kitchen suddenly made terrifying sense. It wasn't a momentary, isolated loss of temper over a babysitting request. It was the physical manifestation of their deep-seated entitlement. To them, I was never a CEO. I was merely a placeholder, a custodian keeping the corporate seat warm until the real heirs were ready to collect. When I demanded to know how they justified this theft, my mother wept, claiming they honestly thought the business was simply too much pressure for a single woman. A single woman. That phrase hit me harder than Jake's palm ever could. They didn't view me as a founder or an employer. They saw an unmarried female whose assets required patriarchal supervision. Jake, desperate and cornered, as the documents laid bare his incompetence, pointed a trembling finger at me. You think you're better than us because you work all the time. This family made you. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I looked around the room at the people who had siphoned my money, mocked my boundaries, and plotted my ruin while pretending to love me. No, I answered, feeling the final, heavy chain of my childhood loyalty snap. This family trained me to survive without applause. Grandma Ruth gave me a chance. I made myself. Olivia smoothly slid the drafted legacy documents into her leather briefcase, snapping it shut with a resounding click. These are now officially retained as evidence of fraudulent intent, she declared. We turned and walked out the front door, leaving them standing in the ruins of their own greed. They thought they had been managing a compliant, obedient daughter. But as we drove away, they realized they had just handed a corporate owner the exact blueprints of their conspiracy, and the legal retaliation was going to be merciless. By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the emotional theater of the weekend was entirely replaced by the cold, precise machinery of the law. I didn't need to raise my voice anymore. Certified mail is infinitely louder. Olivia initiated the onslaught by dispatching a barrage of formal legal notices. Jake received a rigid directive to surrender the Caldwell Coastal Services SUV by Wednesday at noon or face an immediate police report for unauthorized possession of a corporate vehicle. Melissa was served with a heavily documented inventory of her fraudulent credit card transactions, complete with a demand for full restitution. My parents received a formal suspension of all discretionary financial support. I wasn't completely ruthless. I agreed to cover their essential medical premiums for 30 more days while they arranged alternatives. However, those payments would now go directly to the healthcare providers. There would be no more liquid cash handed over for them to secretly redirect toward Jake's lifestyle. But the most terrifying letter bypassed my family entirely. It went straight to the wealth manager who had helped them draft that treacherous legacy plan. Olivia slapped his firm with a strict litigation hold, mandating the immediate preservation of all emails, calendar invites, and draft documents involving my corporate data. He was officially put on notice that he had utilized proprietary financial information without the CEO's consent. That same afternoon, I walked into the local precinct and filed an official incident report regarding the slap in the kitchen. I didn't press criminal battery charges immediately, but I needed a verifiable paper trail. In toxic family ecosystems, memory is highly fluid. Ink is permanent. When the police department followed up with a routine inquiry call to their residence, my mother was incandescent with rage. She called me, her voice trembling with indignation. "Are you actively trying to ruin your brother's reputation?" she hissed. "No," I replied, my tone devoid of any emotion. "He hit me. I simply wrote it down." Jake returned the SUV on Wednesday with exactly 13 minutes to spare, slamming the keys onto my receptionist's desk with a look of pure venom. But losing his prestigious car was just a minor casualty. The real warfare commenced when my parents, desperate to salvage their crumbling public image, attempted to rewrite the entire weekend's history for our extended family. My family had always operated on a simple, unspoken rule: whoever tells the story first owns the truth. Since anger and legal intimidation hadn't worked, my parents quickly pivoted to their absolute specialty: social sabotage. By Thursday, the extended family grapevine was buzzing with a heavily redacted version of the weekend's events. My parents began making tearful phone calls to aunts, uncles, and cousins, claiming that Jake had merely lost his temper because I had spitefully abandoned his helpless toddlers at the last minute. They spun a tragic, melodramatic tale where I was the erratic villain who ruined a family vacation, triggered my mother's blood pressure crisis, and ruthlessly brought a corporate attorney to a private Sunday dinner. The pressure campaign worked, initially. My Aunt Sarah called me, her tone dripping with condescending sympathy. "Nina, dear, we know you work hard, but family shouldn't keep score. You need to forgive your brother. Don't throw away your blood over a silly misunderstanding." The old Nina would have panicked. I would have spent a frantic hour on the phone, crying, explaining, begging to be understood. The new Nina didn't argue at all. While my aunt was still preaching about the virtue of forgiveness, I silently opened my phone and sent her exactly 3 text messages. First, the time-stamped high-definition photograph of the purple handprint on my cheek. Second, a screenshot of the 3 licensed childcare options I had emailed Jake weeks before the Malibu trip, options he had explicitly rejected because he wanted free labor. Third, the receipt for Marisol, the professional sitter I had personally paid for after the assault to ensure the twins were safe. I didn't add a caption. I just let the irrefutable evidence speak. 3 hours later, my phone chimed. It was a single text from Aunt Sarah. "I am so sorry, Nina. I had no idea." That was the exact moment the Caldwell family dynamic fractured permanently. My parents had banked on my historical silence to protect their lies. They forgot that their curated version of reality was completely defenseless against a woman who kept receipts. But as the suffocating web of gossip collapsed around him, Jake grew desperate. And when Jake couldn't manipulate the narrative from afar, he resorted to his final, most aggressive tactic: showing up uninvited. Jake had always believed that physical proximity equaled power. Since he couldn't control the narrative from afar anymore, he decided to try and bully me back into submission in person. On Friday afternoon, he marched through the revolving glass doors of Caldwell Coastal Services with the arrogant swagger of a man who genuinely thought he owned the building. He breezed past the waiting area, aiming straight for my executive suite. But he didn't account for Tasha. My lead assistant stood up from her desk, smoothly intercepting his path. "Excuse me," Jake scoffed, attempting to lazily sidestep her. "I'm Nina's brother. Move." Tasha didn't flinch. She maintained an impeccably professional, utterly unyielding posture. "And she is my boss. You do not have an appointment, sir. You cannot go back there." Jake's face flushed with that volatile, familiar rage. "I don't need a schedule to see my own flesh and blood. Get out of my way before I have her fire you." He took a menacing step forward, trying to physically intimidate her. It was the exact same aggressive posturing he had used right before he struck me in my parents' kitchen, but this wasn't my mother's house, and Tasha wasn't paralyzed by a lifetime of toxic family guilt. She simply reached for the desk console and pressed a single button. "Security, we have a hostile trespasser in the main lobby refusing to leave." Jake froze. Several high-profile corporate clients in the waiting area turned to stare at him. The sheer indignity of being publicly labeled a trespasser and being escorted out of a commercial building by uniformed guards humiliated him far more profoundly than slapping me ever did. 10 minutes later, a text vibrated on my phone, sent from his car in the parking lot. "You are actually choosing strangers over your own blood?" I typed my response without a shred of hesitation. "I am choosing safety over access." Then I blocked his number. Sitting in my office, the contrast was staggering. The biological family I was born into had watched me get assaulted and did absolutely nothing. The corporate family I built had shielded me flawlessly. But as the adrenaline faded, I realized physical boundaries weren't enough. As long as there were lingering financial loopholes, they would keep using the word family as a lockpick. It was time to initiate the audit and bleed the poison out completely. The emotional theater of the weekend was over, replaced by the cold, unforgiving reality of spreadsheets. Over the next few days, Olivia and I conducted a forensic audit of the so-called emergency family credit card. The line items were sickening. There were no medical copays or urgent household repairs. Instead, the statements revealed a prolonged, shameless siphoning of funds. High-end steakhouses, online designer boutiques, premium golf equipment, gas station charges hundreds of miles from any medical facility, and a staggering tab at a luxury hotel bar. When Olivia presented the itemized list, their excuses were a masterclass in what she clinically diagnosed as convenient confusion. My parents claimed they assumed the exorbitant charges were Jake's responsibility. Jake arrogantly claimed he assumed our father had authorized them. Melissa claimed she thought it was just a generic pool of family money. Mysteriously, everyone had completely misunderstood the rules in the exact direction that benefited their own wallets. I didn't want to spend the next 5 years of my life locked in a bitter, soul-draining lawsuit. I refused to let my future be consumed by chasing every stolen dollar from people who had already taken enough of my peace. I just wanted a clean break. So Olivia drafted a settlement offer. It was generous, but ironclad. They had to formally acknowledge the $184,730 debt, return all remaining company property, sign a strict, non-interference agreement, cease using the Caldwell Coastal Services name entirely, and agree to a legally binding repayment schedule. If they refused, we would proceed with full civil litigation. The pushback was predictable. My father called the structured repayment schedule insulting. Olivia politely reminded him that a corporate fraud investigation would be considerably more insulting. My mother wept, claiming that signing a legal contract would break our family apart forever. I calmly told her that the family broke the precise moment she nodded approvingly after her son struck her daughter in the face. Jake defiantly swore he would never sign. He held his ground for exactly 3 days. Then, his bank unexpectedly froze a pending loan application because his actual debt-to-income ratio, now exposed without my phantom corporate income artificially padding his accounts, was abysmal. Suddenly, his fierce principles became highly negotiable. Melissa signed first. My parents followed. Jake signed last. His jaw clenched tight, pressing his pen into the document so aggressively it tore through the bottom page. The final stipulation was a written apology, because Olivia insisted that financial repayment was not a substitute for remorse. Jake's first attempt was a cowardly deflection. "I'm sorry things got out of hand." Olivia mailed it back with a single sticky note attached. "Try again." His second version was thin and reluctant, but it finally named the specific act. "I am sorry I slapped you." The ink was dry, the contracts were filed, and the financial bleeding had finally stopped. But as the weekend approached, I was about to learn that enforcing a boundary on a legal document is infinitely easier than enforcing it in your own heart when the ghosts of your past try to pull you back in. My parents possessed an astonishing ability to compartmentalize reality. Once the settlement documents were finalized and the ink had dried, they genuinely expected me to appear at their house for our traditional Sunday roast. To them, those heavy legal signatures were nothing more than a reset button on a malfunctioning household appliance. I didn't go. Instead, I spent that Sunday morning in my sunlit corporate boardroom alongside Tasha and my operations manager. We weren't nursing grudges. We were drafting bulletproof infrastructure. We systematically rewrote every internal company policy I should have implemented years ago. From that day forward, no relative would ever be granted informal access to business resources. No personal expenses would ever flow through our corporate accounts. No emergency support would be dispersed without strict written terms. Initially, laying down those sterile, bureaucratic rules felt incredibly cold. I was quietly grieving the illusion of the family I thought I had. But as the afternoon wore on, a profound clarity washed over me. I realized that erecting walls isn't always an act of punishment. Sometimes, a wall is simply the architectural shape that self-respect must take after your love has been repeatedly weaponized against you. My parents eventually attempted to bridge the gap, but they only spoke in the dialects of their own flaws. My father apologized in the language of bruised pride, muttering, "I may have misjudged some things." My mother apologized in the language of social optics, sighing, "I never wanted our family to look like this." I finally stopped trying to mentally translate their hollow sentences into the genuine remorse I actually deserved. That was one of the most liberating breakthroughs of my entire life. If someone hands you half accountability, you accept it as exactly that, and you permanently adjust their access to your life accordingly. The adult conflict was settled. The financial hemorrhage was completely cauterized, but there was still one fragile, unresolved piece of this wreckage that kept me awake at night, terrified that my newly forged boundaries might inadvertently punish the truly innocent, Ava and Leo. The hardest boundary to enforce wasn't financial, it was emotional. I refused to let Ava and Leo become weaponized pawns in an adult war they couldn't possibly understand. A few weeks after the settlement was signed, my phone buzzed with an unknown caller ID. I answered cautiously. It was Melissa. Her voice sounded fragile, completely stripped of its usual suburban arrogance. "They keep asking why Aunt Nina isn't coming over anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Jake keeps telling them you're trying to destroy our family. I don't know what to tell them." I closed my eyes, a sharp, physical ache radiating through my chest, but I did not cave. "Tell them I love them endlessly," I replied softly, "and tell them the adults are currently working through adult problems." Melissa began to weep, real, uncurated tears this time. "Melissa," I continued, my tone steadying, "I paid your preschool deposits. I covered your emergency sitters, Leo's hospital copay, and half your grocery deliveries last winter. If me simply stopping my financial support feels like I am destroying you, maybe you should ask yourself why your entire life was built on my exhaustion." She had absolutely no answer. The line went dead. To ensure the twins' future was protected, I established a secure college trust for both of them. It was locked down tight, remaining solely under my executive control. I had finally learned a vital lesson. Loving innocent children does not require trusting the adults raising them. For 3 months, the heavy silence held, until one afternoon, Tasha placed a strange, bulky envelope on my desk. Inside were 2 uneven, crayon-drawn invitations to a kindergarten spring recital. I almost threw the crayon-drawn invitations away. The mere thought of being in the same room as my family made my chest tight. But tracing the wobbly, uneven hearts Ava and Leo had sketched, I realized something vital. Letting adult cowardice destroy a child's pure affection was a tragedy I refused to participate in. I arrived at the school auditorium 10 minutes late, slipping quietly into a folding chair in the back row. Halfway through a chaotic rendition of a spring song, Ava spotted me. She beamed and waved so frantically she nearly knocked over the boy standing next to her. A moment later, Leo leaned forward and screamed, "Aunt Nina!" right into the center microphone. A ripple of warm laughter echoed through the room. Sitting there, taking in the terrible lighting and the paper flowers taped to the walls, everything felt blissfully uncomplicated. For the first time in my adult life, I was experiencing love without a pending invoice attached to it. After the applause faded, I navigated the crowded parking lot, intending to slip away unnoticed, but Jake was waiting by my car. Melissa stood several yards back with the twins, while my parents meticulously pretended to examine a nearby bulletin board. Jake looked different. He wasn't magically transformed or glowing with newfound humility, but his arrogant polish had definitely worn off. He just looked exhausted. "The kids miss you," he muttered, nervously shifting his weight. "I miss them too," I replied, my voice neutral. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of the last 3 months. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. "I'm in a debt management program. Melissa made me cut up the credit cards. We even had to sell the boat membership. I hadn't even known there was a boat membership." He stared down at the asphalt. "I still think you went completely nuclear on us, Nina." He swallowed hard, his jaw working. "But I shouldn't have hit you. Ever." It wasn't a perfect cinematic redemption. He was still Jake, stubbornly clinging to the belief that my boundaries were an extreme overreaction. But it was the very first sentence he had ever spoken that didn't demand I carry his shame for him. I established the new rules right there on the pavement. I would see the twins, but only in public spaces, scheduled visits, no last-minute emergencies, and absolutely no using the children to pass passive-aggressive messages. Bereft of his former financial leverage, Jake simply nodded. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I didn't feel the triumphant thrill of a conqueror. I didn't feel vindictive or smug. Instead, as I steered my car toward the coast, I felt something entirely unfamiliar. I didn't drive back to my apartment that afternoon. Instead, I pointed my car west, winding my way down the Pacific Coast Highway until I reached the rugged, familiar cliffs of Malibu. I pulled over onto a scenic shoulder, cut the engine, and just sat there, listening to the rhythmic, violent crash of the waves against the rocks. The sky was a muted, overcast gray, but to me, the horizon had never looked clearer. To Jake and Melissa, Malibu was nothing more than a status symbol. It was a picturesque stage designed to broadcast their fabricated affluence to a gallery of strangers. But as I sat there with a lukewarm cup of coffee resting in my hands, inhaling the sharp, salt air, this stretch of coastline transformed into something entirely different. It became a monument to my own emancipation. For the first time in a decade, my phone sat completely silent in the passenger seat. There were no frantic demands to fix a shattered itinerary. No one was expecting me to quietly absorb their incompetence. I wasn't auditing a crisis, and I wasn't shrinking myself to make my family feel massive. Looking out at the endless expanse of the Pacific, a profound revelation settled into my bones. The luxurious weekend getaway that my family accused me of ruining was never actually theirs to begin with. It was simply the journey where I finally stopped traveling away from myself. People think that revenge concludes the moment the legal documents are signed and the money is recovered, but they are wrong. The real vengeance was something much quieter and far more lethal to their control. People love dramatic revenge because it looks so cinematic from the outside. A slap in a kitchen, a canceled luxury vacation, a flood of 63 desperate phone calls, a frozen credit card, and a family's secret legacy plan exposed on a glass coffee table. But true vengeance isn't a loud spectacle. It is breathtakingly quiet. It was the first night I slept without needing their permission to feel angry. It was the very first bill I tossed in the trash instead of paying. It was the first Sunday dinner I skipped without offering a frantic, over-explained apology. It was the first time my mother cried, and I did not set myself on fire to keep her warm. It was the first time Jake said, "I need," and I processed it as mere information, rather than a military command. I still love my family, but I love them in carefully measured doses. I love Ava and Leo without condition because innocent children should never have to pay the toll for their parents' failures. I love my mother and father from a distance that rigorously protects my peace. I even love the idea of the man my brother could eventually become. But I no longer build the foundation of my life, waiting for him to magically transform into that person. Establishing strict boundaries did not make me a bitter woman. It made my love honest. Jake wanted me to babysit his kids so he could drink champagne by the ocean. Instead, he learned the agonizing difference between a sister and a servant. My parents wanted me to stay silent so their pristine suburban image could survive. Instead, they learned that my silence was the absolute most expensive service I had ever provided, and my subscription was permanently canceled. If you have ever been the dependable one, you know the trap. But the door out of a lifetime of engineered guilt does not always swing open with a dramatic speech. Sometimes it unlocks with a stinging cheek, a trembling hand, a glowing laptop screen, and one quiet, devastating decision. Shut it down. Disclaimer: this story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental